Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Climate Neutrality Forum. Yesterday we had a deep dive into the science, what it tells us where we are in terms of climate neutrality. We also talked about the role of models, climate models, of observation satellites, and also the role of land. That was a very dense day. Today we will focus on major aspects such as energy transition and the realm of different facets of carbon dioxide removals. We start with the energy transition, and for this session we have a number of online and in-person contributors. So energy transition, certainly a very important aspect in climate neutrality, so central towards climate neutrality, in line with the European Green Deal, of course, also always important to remind us of the European Green Deal. So in this session, we will first hear 2 presentations. The first presentation is given online by Kimon Keramidas. Kimon, can you hear us?
Yeah, I already checked it.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Can we also see? Okay, I'm here. Kimon, good morning.
Good morning.
Uh,
Can you hear me? One, two, 1, 2. Yes, hello.
Okay, maybe just to introduce very briefly, Kimon is an energy system modeler working at the European Commission, the Joint Research Center. He specialized in global energy forecasting, EU and international energy markets, and the energy economics environment nexus. And I think, Kimon, you join us from Seville, if I'm not mistaken. Great. Over to you, Kimon.
Okay, let me see. Should be able to share, and you should be able to see my screen. Please confirm to me that you can see, because I can no longer see you. All right. So hello from rainy Seville. Thank you very much for the invitation. And indeed, I will be talking to you about energy in particular and how the energy transition relates to climate change. I will be talking to you about our annual report here at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, the Global Energy and Climate Outlook, for which we are now preparing the latest release, or the 2024 edition. So just quickly, for those who are new to this, every year the GRC publishes the Global Energy and Climate Outlook, which gives global projections of energy and emissions under different scenarios. Each year we take a specific focus. For example, we have focused on the impacts of COVID-19. We have focused on co-benefits of air pollution and climate policy, on energy trade, investment needs, and such. So the Commission uses GECO in the international climate negotiations and in its climate diplomacy activities with outreach to third countries. And it is also used to support assessments from the IPCC. We submit scenarios to the IPCC, to the UNEP emissions gap report, and to various model comparison projects. Most recently, it has been used to support the Commission's position that ended up in the renewable energy and emission and energy efficiency targets that were announced at COP28. So today I will be focusing on some of the most recent results in our GECO 24 yet to be published, and some findings from last year, GECO 23, where we took a deep dive into the investment needs for the global energy transition. So, well, the EU uses a big toolbox of models to do its policy making. You might be familiar with such an image here. What I'm going to focus on today is the energy part, and more particular, the global energy part. This is done in-house at the JRC with the POLS model, long-term energy system model. And for the GECO report, we couple this with a macroeconomic computable general equilibrium model, GME3. So a number of parameters from the energy system model are used to calculate the macroeconomic impacts of climate policies. And we'll come back to that later. So one of the key results, one of the main outputs of this work that we do is these projections of emissions globally. But behind that, there's a big work of updating all the energy statistics and prices and emissions of G20 countries and a number of big energy consumers and emitters. So this view is the aggregate global view of how we project emissions to behave under different policy assumptions. So the top line is our reference, no additional climate and energy policies compared to today, only market forces and technology learning are driving the energy mix and the resulting emissions. And then progressively moving down, we have our line for a scenario where we have implemented the targets of the NDCs, and a bit lower, considerably lower scenario where we have also implemented the long-term strategy announcements for net zero for various countries. And finally, at the very bottom, the ambitious transition towards a 1.5 degree compatible world, where emissions decrease drastically during this decade and the following, and reach net zero around mid-century. So you can see here that, there is an implementation gap still remaining in 2030 between our reference scenario and our NDC scenario, meaning that additional policies still need to be passed in various countries around the world in order to reach the fastly approaching 2030 targets. And an ambition gap wherein countries have announced targets for mid-century and beyond for net zero. However, not all of them have done so. So there is still an ambition gap to close the gap towards 1.5 in the long term. So globally, we need both more policy and more ambition. However, progress is being made. You can see here that we project emissions to peak in all scenarios, and in particular in our reference scenario, very soon, in this year, next year, the year after, but around the middle of this decade. So that is perhaps good news. So since this is going to be the 10th edition of GECO, it was an opportune time to look back on the progress that has been made over the past decade of following climate and energy policies. So what we have done here is plot the CO2 emissions from energy and industry from our reference equivalent, if you will, from the various GECOs over the past 10 years. So we only consider current adopted policies in place at the time. So what do we see? Over the past 10 years, 10 years ago, we were projecting a strong continued increase at a fast pace, decelerating pace in the second half of the century, but still strongly increasing emissions by the end of the century. And closer to today, we have had the effect of COVID in the midterm. But most importantly, we have seen that we have been projecting emissions to stabilize. And in the most recent scenarios, 2023 and 24, we are even projecting a relative decrease of emissions to mid-century and the stabilization in the second half of the century. So this is a considerable improvement. So much so that by the end of the century, you have essentially cut our baseline projections by half, by a difference that is more or less equivalent to the size of today's emissions. So this is quite important. So this is mostly as a result of continual improvements in decarbonization policy. So there is a positive feedback loop that is happening. More policies are implemented, leading to more favorable market conditions. This results in more deployment of low emission technologies, which in turn creates cost reductions. for these technologies, which in turn reduce the cost of each subsequent policy intervention. So this is a virtual cycle caused by climate policy. And we can hope that this continues. You could say that this is indeed good news, because if we now turn not to emissions but the projected temperatures at the end of the century, we started with temperature projections of above 3 degrees, around 3.2 degrees, and are now projecting an end of the century temperature around 2.6 degrees. So this is a reduction of 0.6 degrees over 10 years projections, and a significant convergence towards the 1.5 degree target. So you could say that this is indeed good news. However, we should not take it for granted that this will continue in the future, and that it is going to be easy to reach the 1.5 degree target. Additional policies are still needed, and we are going to be moving towards a zone of effort that is indeed very challenging in order to reach 1.5. So moving on to some more difficult news. Here we're going to focus on the 1.5 degree and the issue of the global temperature overshoot, the overshoot above 1.5 degrees that is likely to happen in the coming decades. So what we have done here is run a number of sensitivities around our central 1.5 degree scenario, which already exhibits ambitious reductions in the coming decades, emissions reductions. And we have run sensitivities wherein we have forced the model to decrease its emissions further, to decrease the overshoot by 0.1 degrees, or relax the constraint in order to have the overshoot increase by 0.1 and 0.2 degrees. And what does that tell us for the key renewable and energy efficiency targets that were announced at COP28? Well, you might remember there is an 11 terawatt renewable capacity deployment and a multiplication by 2 of energy efficiency rate of improvement in this COP28 pledge, which is indeed compatible with our central 1.5 degree scenario. If we allow the world to increase the overshoot, but with considerable climate damages and human suffering, we can have these targets decreased to 2.6, multiplication by 2.6, or multiplication by 1.4. But conversely, if we want to limit the overshoot by 0.1 degree, the effort is much, much higher. We need a multiplication by 6.6 for renewables and a multiplication by 3.7 of efficiency. So more than a doubling, and almost a doubling of the effort just for 0.1 degree, which climate science tells us is actually quite important in terms of climate damages and potential exceedance of climate tipping point. So the decarbonization targets in the coming decade, this is just for 2030, is critical, and delayed action sees increasing overshoot and high risk of climate damages. So the current decade is really critical. So next, what we have done is to see how we can achieve that more concretely. And we have zoomed in on energy-related investments. These are substantial, and however, we find that they're achievable if we consider the size of the overall global economy. So what we have plotted here, on the left is the reference scenario, and you have going from the bottom to the top, investments related to energy supply, first in fossil fuels, in the reddish colors, second, the yellowish colors in power, and finally, new fuels such as hydrogen, ammonia, and e-fuels. And we can see that even in the reference scenario, there is a relative increase of investment needs. However, as a share of global GDP, and this is the right-hand axis of each graph, and the line. This corresponds to an even decrease of investments as a share of GDP, because GDP is projected to increase faster than this increasing investment needs. So what happens in the 1.5 degree scenario here on the right? You can definitely tell that there is a considerable increase in investment needs in order to achieve the decarbonization goal. We increase our investment needs from below 2 trillion annually to over 4 trillion annually by the middle of the century. And this increase happens in particular in the power sector and in the new fuels, hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels. However, as a share of GDP, and again, this is the right-hand axis, this is a relative increase compared to the historical average, but still we remain within the range of 1.5% of GDP, so apparently not unfeasible. Further focus on specific technologies, clean tech investments. And these are clean technologies in power generation, hydrogen and e-fuels, but also fuel cells in vehicles, batteries in vehicles and stationary storage, heat pumps for the electrification of buildings, and in addition, direct air capture at the very top, direct air capture of CO2 in order to remove any residual emissions, and to fuel, to provide fuel for the e-fuels. So this is the sector where we see the most important and salient increase in investment needs. We go from below $1 trillion annually today to, well, 3 trillion already during this the current decade, which is the most dramatic increase, and still a sustained increase all the way to the middle of the century. In particular, spending in batteries of electric vehicles increases no less than 16-fold. So this is the largest relative increase. So new markets are being created, new investment opportunities exist. But the challenge will be to sustain this over the long run. Now, we have also turned our attention to the employment effects of the energy transition with our macroeconomic modeling. And we project global employment to substantially expand in the 1.5 degree scenario. If we look at total employment, that means all sectors, everybody that is employed, and this is a global graph, increases over time in both our reference and our 1.5 degree scenario. So no major impact is visible by looking at the totals. Impacts of climate policy are visible if we zoom in into the relative changes by sector. So no surprise here, there's a big relative change in employment for fossil fuel extraction and transformation, and an increase of employment in electricity generation due to the deployment of renewables and other low carbon technologies, but also due to the increased electrification of end uses, so a double effect. So new jobs are being created, direct jobs in power generation in particular, increase over time. There is a relative notable increase also in biomass-related jobs, here in yellow, and nuclear, here in orange, on top of the wind and solar jobs that one could expect. So there is creation of 4.7 million direct jobs related to power generation in our 1.5 degree scenario, which is really considerable. But what we have done in our analysis is dig deeper, thanks to investment matrices and tracking the flows along the supply chain of how these technologies are supplied, and looked at indirect jobs. So what does that mean? That means that, for example, if you install a wind turbine, this triggers construction jobs in order to do the installation itself. It also triggers jobs for the creation of the different components of the wind turbine. in different parts of the world. And these parts are traded and constructed and used at the point of use. So all the direct jobs that we were talking about earlier were only at the point of use of this technology. But what we are talking about, when we are talking about indirect jobs, we're looking at jobs induced by this need for the technology, for that technology. So they can be elsewhere as well. So we see that there is a considerable amount of jobs that are indirectly created thanks to the climate transition. Jobs in the construction sector in particular increase due to the infrastructure expansion needed. This is in blue. And in yellow, job creation in the electrical and equipment goods are mostly driven by the expansion of solar PV and wind. So this is another positive story that we can associate to the transition in order to mitigate the job losses in other sectors. So finally, in conclusion, I would like to underline that the current decade is crucial if we want to meet our 1.5-degree Paris Agreement target. Emission reductions are particularly steep and challenging, and they require a considerable increase in the deployment of low emissions equipment across the board. However, it is still possible if we see that the total investment needs in energy supply are close to their historical average. And we saw at the end here that investment in low emission technology stimulates output, and decarbonizing creates job opportunities both in the energy sector and in adjacent sectors. Everything I've presented here is available on our website, and what you saw today is some outputs from last year's GECO, but also from GECO 2024, which is going to be published imminently, so around the time of the COP, very soon. So I invite you to visit our website. Thank you very much.
Kimon, thank you, Kimon, for this really comprehensive overview of the outlook. I'm sure there's a lot of questions already triggered, but I would propose we go directly into our next presentation, asking still, Kimon, you're going to stay with us for the whole session, and we can then include you in the panel, and there will be questions to you. Is that fine for you? Just make a sign because we can't speak. Great. Okay, Kimon will stay with us. So our next speaker, we hear a presentation from Jonathan Lonsdale. Jonathan is a Senior Consulting Director at ICT and specialized in ICF. Yes, I was like ICT. Okay, ICF. So and specialized in European sustainable finance and climate policy, climate neutral innovation and competitiveness. He's also an expert on sustainable finance and climate policy and works as an advisor for the European Commission. And I think the work is related to this that you will present. Thank you. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Petra. And you? Thanks, Petra. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to those online. Thanks for inviting me to present the findings of our recent study for DG Research and Innovation, which concluded 6 months ago. And I've got 15 minutes to distill 18 months of research into this presentation. So I'm going to give you a very high-level snapshot of that work. It's over 300 pages long. I commend you to read it online, and there will be references to that. So let's go. There we are. So our study was timed to coincide with the middle of the framework program, Horizon Europe, in order to form part of the discussions for the next framework program, which I suppose is called FP Framework Program 10, whatever name they'll come up with. But that, as you probably know, is worth almost 100 billion euros of investment over that period. So Kimon talked about investment needs over the next 10 years that are critical, but we were taking quite deliberately a longer term view into what was required beyond 2030 focused specifically on mitigation solutions and technologies. And ICF led a team of organizations that are renowned for their expertise in innovation, ecosystem research, investment into low carbon innovations, and partners focused on socioeconomic perspectives like Cambridge Econometrics. And it wasn't just my team, this team of which comprised about 18 researchers in total. We had a total of 5 external reviewers that reviewed our work at key points in the study. And we also had a total of about 100 experts focused on particular research and innovation areas, drawn not just from the 5 respective organizations, but more broadly. And on top of that, we used different mechanisms to engage with stakeholders to test out our emerging findings through workshops and a conference at the end. Now, Petra, you mentioned the European Green Deal, and in fact, Ursula von der Leyen in 2018, when that was launched, said that we do not have all the answers yet. This is Europe's man on the moon moment. And I think that really sort of encapsulates the essence of what we were trying to research here, recognizing that the Paris Agreement threw out a lot of challenges, and indeed the research by the likes of the EIEE and OECD recognized that rates of innovation are insufficient, and many solutions required to achieve climate neutrality are still at very early stages of development. So we need to recognize the long-term innovation cycles and start to think about how we can influence that through the research and innovation program. We also need to remain ahead and build on European strengths. So not necessarily reinventing the wheel right now. It's about trying to understand where Europe already has leading edge research and can build on that and bring that together in a more systemic fashion. So these are the drivers that were foremost in our mind and what we sought to try and overcome through our research. And we took an exploratory research approach to this 18-month study. And you can see here the various elements that we deployed. First of all, a very broad literature review, then an analysis of climate scenarios, including those presented, looking at global, EU, national scenarios, taking account of scenarios that were very focused on technologies, as you've seen, but also focused on those that had a strong emphasis on societal trends and behavior change, recognizing that those two are critical in combination. Third, we devised solution landscapes, which I'll come on to. These sit at the heart of our report, and they combine technology solution trees with challenges, so framework conditions linked to targets, policy targets, and mission-oriented goals. And those helped us to map these mitigation solutions in a broader context. Fourth, I've mentioned workshops, so I'll move straight to the evaluation framework, and I'll deal with that in a bit more detail in due course. But you can see here a snapshot of the 5 different pillars that we used to help score the various solutions and research and innovation areas. We had over 150, as I mentioned. And then finally, we took this systemic perspective and considered the needs-based, the needs of society, and linked our technologies and solutions and research and innovation areas to those areas. And I'll come on to that again. So that's the next one. So we ended up with 17 solution landscapes for climate neutrality. And these were split as you can see, compartmentalized, if you will, into those that link into the projections, the techno-economic climate neutrality scenarios. And then we've got a category linked to carbon removals and GHG removals. And then the final one is linked to lifestyle and societal trends. So this is also a very important aspect. Now here's an example of a solution landscape. I don't expect you to be able to read it all. Like I said, you should take a look at the report where we cover this in depth. But the key things here to understand are we've adopted a design that allows technology push on the left, coupled with demand pull on the right. And by adopting that sort of design, you can focus not only on the technology developments, but also on the enabling environment. And it allows us to clearly articulate the end goals of a particular solution. So you can see on the right, the provision of affordable, clean, and reliable electricity. But then you work your way back from that, and you uncover a whole series of challenges. And then you can see 11 different research and innovation areas that are then linked themselves into key aspects of the value chain. So not only focused on technologies linked to the cell technology itself, but also the application, the systems, but then importantly, and this is an important feature of our findings and linking to the long term, the whole area of materials and resources. And if you look in detail at it, you'll see actual end-of-life PV, which is now starting to become an issue in some areas where they have been, where they have deployed PV technologies for over 30 years. So we're starting to consider a very holistic approach to this and what that means for research and innovation funding writ large. So I'll move on to the next. Now, to give you a bit more, it's my little magnifying glass there. So you can see here that an important part of this solution landscape and all solution landscapes was that we took into account general purpose technologies. So here actually is one of the, I picked this particular solution landscape because it had 4 GPTs. Others have perhaps 2 or 1. But here you can see the application of 4 blockchain, quantum, space technologies, and AI. And that is already having an impact within not only the development of new technologies, but also the application of those technologies. Linking into the right side, here you can get a sense of those challenges linked to the end goal. So we're very much thinking about solutions as they will be deployed, what sort of challenges are required. So it's not just about making it ready for commercial deployment, it's about how it's going to be used by those, the end user communities, whatever they take, whatever form they take, whether it's households, industry, or another type of end use. So with the built environment, and I'm focusing here on energy, built environment, and mobility, quite deliberately. Here you've got buildings they form a central element with construction materials of focus, covering 4 research and innovation areas. But also the solution landscape shows an active interaction with the built infrastructure, its environment, the built environment, and end users, like I said. So you get a sense here of the complexity underpinning the built environment and the fact that it's important that if we're focused on one research and innovation area, we need to, again, think overall in the round and think about how research can link up to other capabilities across European institutions, research and technology organizations. So it's a call out to, if we think about research and innovation program, about performing projects that bring together different capabilities and going one step beyond what might be currently deployed. And you can see in there, I just wrote, just thinking about energy, the integration of renewables and e-mobility. So clearly, some jurisdictions across Europe now are mandating that new build must have integrated renewables, must have vehicle charging points, but the picture isn't by any means consistent across Europe. And on decarbonising mobility, obviously transport represents over a quarter of European GHG emissions. So this represented a very important aspect of our research. The target safe and low carbon solutions for goods and individuals. And it focuses on all forms of transport. So obviously the maritime and aviation coming into the ETS, the opportunities for funding of those can be seen, for example, through the Innovation Fund, which has integrated that into its calls for funding. But there's, you can see again opportunities here across the piece. So, key aspect of the research was to move away from the individual technology solutions, and the reasons for that, articulated on this slide, are threefold. First, the uncertainty of picking a winner. Secondly, the potential for lock-in. There are challenges to have research and innovation institutes focusing on their particular research areas, and sometimes that needs to be challenged to avoid inertia and lock-in. And then third, the overall complexity of the challenge facing us needs a greater emphasis on systemic thinking and more collaborative research around areas that we've mapped out. So the evaluation framework that we use to consider how to score projects that I mentioned, we use these 5 pillars and sought to identify research and innovation areas that scored highly in these 5 areas. So you can see this commercial availability, very important. So it can't be commercially available right now. It has a 10 to 15 year window. It must have an important climate mitigation potential. And then linking into sort of sustainable finance agenda, the EU taxonomy, it must not do significant harm to any environmental objectives. So that was one of the underpinning ideas behind the 3rd pillar. 4th, it must generate good, strong socioeconomic benefits. As Kimon mentioned, there's a lot of research that goes into the impacts of new technologies and diffusion, and those macroeconomic models are important for helping to get a sense of the value to society from particular technology innovations or pathways. And critically also, because of the research and innovation program, we looked to try and score areas that were not extensively supported right now. And this provided 21 particular criteria across the 5 pillars that we used. Okay, so I won't read them all out. Okay, so I've mentioned systemic thinking several times already. This is what we've done. So we've taken the neutrality scenarios, and we've taken those solution landscapes, and we've sought to link them into the broader societal needs. So you started to see that starting to come through in the solution landscapes, that this is very much considering the basic needs and societal needs at the bottom. And that leads us to 3 particular nexuses for climate neutrality. So you take the solution landscapes and you can reclassify them into these 3 nexuses. And the importance here is that we're starting to group those into areas that you must consider in the round when you're undertaking planning for research and innovation, because there are obviously linkages between them and trade-offs to be had against certain things and interlinkages. So when you take those solution landscapes and put that into the evaluation framework, what I should say is, that's Power BI to visualize the results. What we did is we had the team produce its scores, and then those were peer reviewed several times across the expert groups and then by the steering group as well. So it's not the last word in, and it's not a ranking system, I should stress. So that what appears at the top is merely indicative of the research that we've done, and it should form an insight into, the next steps for planning. But what you can see, and I hope maybe you can read it, the top is actually end-of-life recycling for wind turbines. So here, again, a longer-term perspective, wind turbines that were deployed in the 80s, 90s, huge growth over the last 10, 15 years. Those are going to end, they're going to be repowered, or they're going to be dismantled and recycled. What are we going to do with that? Second, supply side flexibility, including virtual power plants. That came through strongly in the scoring. Third one was recycling of construction materials. Again, I don't need to stress the embedded carbon within that, but clearly there's opportunities across many countries for doing more around that, and innovation isn't quite there yet. So overall, those are the top scoring. This gives you a flavour of the priorities that came through. I've mentioned some of them, but prioritisation on end-of-life treatment and recycling, alternative building materials, including green steel, green cement, nature-based materials were part of that. And then mobility and energy flexibility, focusing on demand and greater use of IT solutions to help with that. Now, energy storage didn't feature highly in the scoring for this particular nexus, and that was for a number of reasons. First, the relatively low novelty, which our experts considered in this area, if you look across the piece. Reliance on critical raw materials. So again, the challenge there, coming back to the evaluation framework. And I guess most importantly, a lot of investment's already been directed at this area. So that's why it didn't score highly and feature. And finally, I suppose, around energy storage, and was illustrated by Kimon, a lot of investment is actually ready to go into deployment, ready off-the-shelf technologies that can be deployed at scale. very rapidly. So that's a useful sort of reinforcement, if you will, of that finding. We also examined the role that research and innovation programs can take, that can play in triggering positive tipping points. I'm not talking about climate tipping points here. I'm talking about societal tipping points. If you think about the growth of mobile phones and how they've, got rid of, I think most people don't have cameras anymore, do they? Apart from people, but that's a tipping point. The use of well, I guess you probably know more about tipping points than I do, so I'm not going to lecture on that. But the idea here is that you can create scale within the research and produce some innovations that, with the benefit of those behavioural uptake, can take off and accelerate. So I suppose PV is a good example of, with the price point coming down rapidly based on subsidies, it just snowballed, and here we are today with rapid takeoff of that in the market. But also wind power, I suppose. Forecasts for wind power, offshore wind, were very pricey going back 15 years. Those were realized very quickly, those cost reductions, through investment in supply chain by developers. So here we used this positive tipping point framework, and the framework relies on 6 levers that help to create the right conditions. And those conditions, or those levers, need to be taken into account, we think, within research and innovation programs. 2 examples on the bottom of the slide: price parity. So you do need to have parity between old and new solutions. And you also need to meet or outperform existing solutions so that they're taken up in the marketplace. And importantly, they will leverage private finance. So final slide, more or less, key recommendations. I think I've illustrated the need to combine the goals, the end goals, with the tipping point. So not just focused on that technology push, but really thinking about what you're trying to achieve and work backwards from that. The evaluation frameworks that I have talked about, we felt that they were a very useful way of helping to bring together this holistic view of what's going on and think in the round about what should be funded as a priority, and move away from technologies that perhaps have got too much research funding and don't need it anymore. Third, potential of GPTs. We've all been impacted, I think, probably most rapidly over the last year by AI. It seems to be pervading everything that we do now, but it has advantages. This can be deployed along with other GPTs to help accelerate innovations. Things that we didn't think were possible a few years ago are now taking over. Fourth, important to focus on areas that are less mature, but have a high impact and high risk opportunities. So this is the reason for putting public capital into those areas, so that we can come up with new solutions. And that includes transversal research and innovation. So circular design, new materials, that third bucket around new food as well. And a call out also to foster experimentation and develop pilot projects. Think innovatively, imaginatively about what we want to fund. Don't just do the same old. I think there's plenty of appetite. We heard from the stakeholder conference at the end of our report from local authorities, regional authorities that wanted to make a difference and were interested in adopting this type of approach to bring new technologies, new innovations together in a more demonstration sense to test them out. I mentioned the length of our report. but someone did happen to read it, and I leave you with this quote from Kurt Vandenberg, who was on a panel in June discussing the report with the DG of Research and Innovation. So I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope I've given you an insight into some top tips for future research and innovation programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very comprehensive overview of your work. And I think we heard a lot of interesting things. And we'll come back to this. It's also addressed, of course, to the funders that are sitting here in the room, also the European Commission. I'm sure there's going to be a nice discussion. We are now ready to open our panel discussion. I would ask Jonathan to join us here. Please take a seat.
Thank you.
And we have two more panelists, one in the room, and I would like to welcome Paul Dean with us here in the room. He's a senior lecturer in clean energy futures at the University College Cork in Ireland and interested in all aspects of energy and climate policy, as I read. So he will tell us more about this. And we have a panelist also joining online, and I'm pleased to say hello to Massimo Tavoni. Massimo, you are a professor of climate economic modeling and director of the European Institute of Economics and Environment at the Europe Mediterranean Center of Climate Change, CMCC. Pleased to have you with us.
Thanks.
I would like to let the new panelists introduce themselves with their work. Maybe start with Massimo, from your work, also as a perspective as an economist. I would like to give you the floor to introduce briefly your work.
Thanks, Petra. I hope you hear me well enough from the room. Yeah, thanks. And apologies for not being there with you. Thanks for inviting me and for putting together this great panel. And I really appreciated the presentations, the two presentations before me. As you said, I'm work as a climate economist, working trying to understand what are the consequences for economy and society more broadly of the energy transition, and at the same time also quantify what are the implication of climate change on societies and economies. We have to remember that we have both aspects of this game. So we are understanding to what extent the transition towards neutrality, which is the focus of your forum here, will affect, let's say, key variables like Kimon was describing before, thinking about employment, fiscal balances, technological change, innovation, but also question of justice. And I think if I connect to what Kimon presented just before, and I think which is very in line with what we have been saying also in the IPCC safe assessment report about the need for urgency. I think the economic case for a very strong action on climate change is now very, very clear. I mean, this has been disputed for some years, but it's now pretty evident that the cost of a well-coordinating action to reduce emissions and to transition to clean energy fast enough are far much smaller than actually the cost of not doing enough for climate change. So I think the economic case is now pretty clear. And there's also some good signs that indicate that there's also some good progress. And I think there was some discussion about this. The question of finance, the question of technological innovation, the question of potential emission peaking already this decade, led by a green technological revolution which is taking place. And yet, precisely at the moment where we see the economics case for climate change being the strongest, we see a lot of political backlash, and we have to be honest about it, and we have to confront that. We see political opposition have been popped out in the past few years that wasn't there just a few years ago. And we see also different attitudes in public perceptions towards the climate problem. It is perceived to be important, but it's also perceived to be potentially risky in the transition. So how can we design, as scientists, as academics, ways and communicate them well to the public that make sure that these, even economic and social benefits on acting on climate change are clear enough? And how to make sure that we can overcome this political resistance, which in many jurisdictions, including also in places which have been leading the energy transition, such as Europe, has become very voiced and very strong in just the recent years. I think that's the kind of next step of research not just looking at the general economic and societal consequences of the energy transition, but the political economic consequences of the climate energy transition. That's where the game is now being played, and that's also where it is more difficult.
Very much, Massimo. I think that's a wonderful statement also to open our panel discussion. I will give the floor to Paul now. Maybe you want to respond to that, but I think that those are things that resonate with you very well. But tell us a bit about your work in the Clean Futures program.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone. Hello again, Massimo. Lovely to see you. And hello, everybody online. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, my research is essentially thinking about the future. It's a great job. You know, we often get very jaded when we're thinking about the problems of climate change, and they're very serious and real, but actually when you look at the solutions and you spend your day looking at the solutions, you not only get to be very optimistic but very determined to deliver them. And my research in the university thinks about, well, how we can heat our homes, move our cars, produce our food, produce our electricity in a clean way. And if I wasn't in this room today talking about decarbonization, what I tell the public is I talk about how our society can move away from fossil fuels. And actually, when you think about that, moving away from fossil fuels for most countries is a really positive thing. In Europe, for example, we don't really have them anyway, so we don't really have a lot to lose in that regard. And as Massimo said, it's not just about what's good for the planet. We all know we need to reduce our greenhouse gas pollution, but actually most of the things we have to do are good for people. We heard from Roni yesterday in terms of health benefits. We heard from Kimon this morning in terms of employment. We've seen the devastation that terrible wars in the Middle East and the Ukraine have caused in terms of geopolitical security. So moving away from fossil fuels fosters all these things, which are very, very positive. And as Massimo said, I think there's acceptance that we need to act. What political leaders, I think, in our side of the world are struggling with is how do you sell it at the doorsteps? How do you make it a tangible, relevant issue for the people who are not in this room? You know, and that's really challenging. And I think the challenge for us there is to talk about energy bills. And we saw from Kimon this morning and from your research, Jonathan, you kind of have to spend money to save money. Okay, you have to invest. And I'm not talking about the stuff that we're doing well in here. We're doing well in terms of, you know, renewables, wind and solar and batteries. That's fine. We need to speed that up. But for the, you know, 400 or 500 million Europeans who are thinking about their energy bills, what does that mean? And telling somebody who's living in a house that's cold that you need to change because the planet's getting warmer doesn't work, okay? So we need to think about innovative and clever ways about incentivizing cleaner heating methods. Part of that is by turning the financial system up on its head. The challenge with renewables is that you pay a lot now for something like an electric car or a heat pump or even a wind turbine or a battery. You pay a lot now and you pay a little over the future. But our financial system is kind of based on you pay a little now and you pay a lot over the lifetime. So we need different ways of thinking about making it affordable. Most people will do the right thing if it is affordable and if it is convenient, whether it's climate change, climate action, or whatever. And I think we've seen that with the electricity industry. You know, in my own country, for example, in Ireland, we removed barriers for planning permission for solar panels, and Ireland is flying now in terms of solar panels. And we're not a sunny country. I was talking to Barbara yesterday about Hungary. Hungary is leading the European challenge in developing solar at the moment. And again, it's about removing barriers, making it easy to do the right thing. And from an industry perspective, I think it's about reducing risk and reducing uncertainty. But I think we need to get better at communicating to people outside of this room about why moving away from fossil fuels is a good thing for us as individuals, for our well-being, for our people, for the people most vulnerable in society, for jobs. And I think it's broadening the base of that message, I think, is a real challenge for all of us.
Thanks a lot, Paul. I think that's quite inspiring what you tell us. And I think here we're moving also in all the questions of equity in the transition, maybe something like the human dimension of the climate neutrality. So we are talking in this room, not so much about the human dimension, but I think the people outside. The human aspect is probably the most important one that relates to behavioral changes and so on and so forth. I would also like to give the floor back to Kimon. We heard you with the presentation. Come in, make yourself heard, and said it's a bit more difficult, but let's try to have a conversation. I just will lay out the rules here for how to ask questions. You can also put them in the chat, and my colleagues will probably bring them to some sort to me. But the most easy thing is that if you have a question, but I will give the floor to you first, Kimon, just to show. I have to throw this microphone to you, and you have to catch it, and then you can ask your question. We test this afterward. But maybe, Kimon, back to you.
Okay, thanks. I won't catch the microphone, virtually though. So yeah, hi Petra, hi Jonathan, hi Paul, hi Max. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And I hear your points, and I agree with them. We have done studies in the past where we also looked at air pollution co-benefits of climate policy. So what you get from doing climate policy, you get reduced fossil fuel use, and you get reduced air pollution, and then you get reduced health impacts, you get reduced hospitalizations, you get reduced morbidity, you get reduced GDP losses because you have less, fewer people having to pause work because of overbearing air pollution. So we have done this work, and we have tried to quantify its cost in terms of, or rather its benefit in monetary terms. And we have mostly found out that in most cases, in most countries around the world, you have the GDP gains in terms of reduced air pollution can pay the bill for the additional cost for doing the energy transition from a high fossil fuels to a low fossil fuels economy. So just by looking at this co-benefit, you can say that it nets out. But indeed, there are so many other co-benefits that we can think of in terms of biodiversity, in terms of water use, and many other dimensions. But indeed, it is difficult to sell when there is already an ingrained system of way of how to operate. So looking at this thing holistically and trying to sell the package and see, explain to your interlocutor how they could arrange and benefit from it is the way forward, I think.
Thank you, Kimon. So you say the work is done. You have studies on these co-benefits, not on all of them, but of many of them. And then maybe getting back to Paul, we need to communicate that. Maybe that's something we should be better in. And I see someone very near to me. I think this is okay. Frank.
Great, thanks to everybody who's spoken there. I'm just thinking, yes, there are good examples, and but how do we accelerate this structurally? How can we bring together that sort of dynamic that you've mentioned, sort of, Paul, at a national level, and what's happening across Europe? How can we get that into a structure and process that overcomes those barriers? And the barriers are as you just said there, the sort of lock-ins that we have in terms of the fossil fuel reliance, etc., etc. How can we better accelerate that transition? Obviously, we need to accelerate it if we are going to keep 1.5 in reach. So I suppose I'd ask the question at a national level, at a European level, and go back globally. I mean, that global transition, what are the key barriers, and how structurally can we address them?
Yeah. Thanks, Frank. I think one of the things that we can do in this room is help improve the climate literacy of our decision makers, of our policy makers, and of our politicians. I have never met an energy or a climate policy maker who doesn't accept the problem of climate change. They get that, they understand it. But again, it's the solutions, giving them a suite of menus that allow them to understand very briefly and very succinctly how moving away from fossil fuels can solve multiple challenges. Again, just helping their literacy, broadening their their perspective on how one solution can solve many problems. And then in many ways, Frank, I guess it's up to them, up to their audience. It depends what element or what lens or perspective of that message will they use depending on the audience that they're talking to. But I think one of the challenges that we've seen in Ireland with climate change is that yes, people accept it, but they don't see it as a relevant problem to them. Climate change used to be something you would see on television happening to other people in other countries. And we're very lucky in Europe, we're rich, right? And we're able to shield ourselves from many of the benefits. So that message, it's worked on the people who get it, but large swathes of the population, and we need to make it tangible and relevant. And that's where, as Kimon said and Massimo, about jobs, about security, about well-being, mental well-being, physical well-being, about affordability. These are different on-ramps to different conversations that will work with many people. And I think the challenge for us is not just to reiterate the message to policymakers that we need to reduce greenhouse gas pollution, they get that, but to help them understand how the solutions to that will help diffuse many of the problems that we're facing across society in transport, industry, residential and farming, etc.
Thank you, Paul. Is anybody else from the panelists wants to come in to respond to this acceleration factor and the literacy improvement and selling the package of co-benefits to the policymakers? If not, yes, there's people in the room. That's good. Oh, the one is very far. So I try here. Wait. Sorry, Massimo?
No, please go ahead. Give the floor to the room.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very interesting presentation. So I would like to come into this discussion about lock-ins and barriers, because you answered Frank by addressing the policymaker, and I do fully agree with that point. However, I'm wondering if we do not need to go much further. I mean, you said previously also the changing political landscape in which we are facing now. So clearly, I would say, well, being quite bold now here, that part of the problem is also that once policymakers are aware and take decisions that would facilitate the transition that we need, it can be that they lose basically their voters' base. And then, so I think we have to go further than policymakers, but really, well, probably education and at least communicating also to the broader public. So my question is there, how do you think we could produce this? And I also would like to bring an additional dimension into it, which we have not addressed until now, is actually also the psychological lock-in that we are in. I mean, especially fossil fuel industries was or is very good at creating actually needs that many people don't really have. So I don't want to state examples now here, but I think you get what I mean. So yeah, I would like maybe, I don't know if you want to express yourself, but I would like to bring this additional dimension to the panel. And I can give on the microphone if you agree.
Go and pick it up. I think it's a very interesting aspect also on the question of, the psychological aspects, and also on, the needs that we are supposed to have that would no one have, and think marketing is a very strong factor here. I think, Massimo, you wanted to come in because it's always a bit difficult to get the online participants also the word back. Massimo.
I think this is a great point.
But you have to be unmuted.
Yeah, I think this is a great point, the one that was just made. It exactly speaks to the point. We sometimes think that policymakers are superpowers, but they don't often. They are much limited in their scope, much more limited in their scope than we actually think they are. And they respond to a variety of needs and constituencies, obviously. And so how do we get that beyond the policymakers, but obviously towards all the actors which are involved in the transition? What we are seeing in this, what is being called backlash, which is very evident from the data, in the European election last year, is also very evident from the surveys we have been running, is actually, emerging obviously as a kind of resistance from, of course, incumbents. And think about the electric, the automotive industry and the transition to electric cars is a perfect example, who of course see this as a potential threat to their business, and as a result also, of course, also fueled a lot of antipathy, let's say, put it this way, against the transition. So we have to find ways to be very transparent and to inform the public as much as we can. And make sure that people understand what are the consequences. I think, for example, the energy crisis with the Ukraine invasion that led to a rapid increase in energy prices. That has been associated with a significant move away from green parties in the population. And why is this the case? I mean, obviously, if we move to clean energy sources produced domestically in Europe, that's actually a good thing compared to importing fossil fuels for countries who are going at war with our neighbors. So in theory, this could be placed, and by the way, also European member states spent a great deal of money in during the Ukraine invasion, the first phase of the Ukraine invasion, to shelter the households and the firms from high energy prices by subsidizing energy. And yet people had a hard time understanding that money was given back to them from the government. They had a hard time understanding the connection between fossil fuel imports and energy price volatility, which is obviously something which makes people quite unhappy. And why is this the case? Because the narrative could have been turned the other way around. The green transition can make Europe, which is frankly importing a lot of its energy from outside, much more resilient to energy price shocks, and also much more equitable and much more just. And this didn't work very well because of a variety of reasons. First, it's not so easy to communicate these facts. Some of these things are quite technical. People even didn't realize that money was given back to them in their energy bills because maybe it was given them not in a very clear way or only at a later time. But also because there was a prevailing narrative that this energy crisis was actually led and created by the energy transition, which obviously was not the case. It was in this case, geopolitics that led to the energy crisis. And so we have to change the narrative. As scientists, we often fixate, rightly so, on the technical aspects. But as you said, Petra, the human dimension of the transition is that what really changes and what really matters ultimately for the success of the transition itself.
Thank you, Massimo. I think there's more people who want me to throw the ball. Let's start with Maria.
Yeah, I found fascinating the mapping exercise that Jonathan presented, because I think that is where we are stuck at the moment. I mean, we have technologies, we know those technologies can be deployed, but those technologies are deployed in systems, and we need to understand the systems very well. And some systems are even interconnected. And one of the things that, for example, I'm really worried about it in the recent years is skills in workers. Because some of the private sector is moving towards some technologies which are ready, but they don't find skilled workers. And this has to be with connecting with the education systems. The other thing that I believe we have to reflect about is that we all think we have 6 years to fulfill a very ambitious targets. But I won't care about the 6 years. I will care about the levers that will allow us for accelerating in the next 10, 15 years. And this requires this more systemic thinking. It requires that all actors are empowered in the solutions, because otherwise they immediately will block, either because they don't understand, either because they are found that they are outside of the systems that are progressing. And my final point is, did you also sort of detected or explore that there is an emerging elephant in the room, which is this tension between rural and urban population? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is really much more powerful sometimes than the ideology in what we observe, for example, on the deployment of renewable energy. So, I mean, how you foresee those things to be done in 6 to 10 years? Because my point is that I believe that even the believers are starting to have doubts about it. So, and that's a very interesting reflection.
Thanks, Maria. Maybe you can throw the microphone over. Thank you.
Okay.
There's more interventions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I see it's emerging that all actors should be, let's say, taken into account. And my question is, do you think we can also find a narrative for the industrial sector? So, I mean, of course, it's really important to have them engaged, directly engaged into the decision. I think the command and control really cannot work, of course, for some of them developing new technologies. The narrative is already, let's say, there, but there is, we know, a very huge lobby of industries that really need to take action and really need to be engaged into this transition.
Thank you, Julia. Maybe getting this question, quite concrete question, back to the panelists. Who would like to react on that? I don't know. Jonathan, I see you thinking.
I'm thinking about industry.
Of the narrative. Yes. So maybe you can try to develop a narrative.
I think there's always been a problem in industry about the smaller players who have problems accessing new technologies or can apply for funding, and the administrative burden, the lack of investment, the way there versus the incumbent large players that are pushing their agenda, and that can crowd out the innovators within industrial sectors. So I'm just thinking about, for example, I mentioned the Innovation Fund. You know, that we know that that's a challenge for smaller players because it's quite a burden. But yeah, SMEs are renowned for being the ones coming up with the innovative ideas. So how to enable, empower smaller actors to take advantage of the financial support that is available to others is really important. I don't know whether on local democracy issues, I think I mentioned opportunities for localized pilot initiatives. Coming back to your point about bringing together, and over there, I think, different actors at all levels. I think you need cross-party consensus, you need visionary politics that is long-term to align with what we need to do. And so it isn't changing every 2 or 3 years. You know, you need consensus there, you need a strong local democratic base that is empowered, devolved powers to take things forward and to enable innovative systemic thinking to take root. To push some of these new ideas and innovations. I mean, very simplistically, in the United Kingdom, there's been terrible, and probably across the rest of Europe, but there's been terrible reduction in local bus transport. They've just put the prices up. You know, people are just. What was I going to say? That bus routes have been stopped. You know, so basically people are stranded. There's no way to get around. They can't afford cars. So that's creating a massive problem about, you know, this rural-urban challenge. And yet, Paul,
thanks.
Did you want to move in?
Do you want to come in on this? Or?
No, I think I agree with you. Actually, the IEA had in their World Energy Outlook last week, really looked at this issue, the equity between rural and urban divides. It's something that needs to be addressed and acknowledged. No simple solutions there, certainly. It's about really proportionally directing different investment to different locations. I think it is a challenge there, and completely agree with you on the trades and the skills. We need more women and men getting into fixing stuff. These are good, meaningful jobs that we can have in Europe that will endure, and I think we certainly need to do a lot more about apprenticeships and encouraging younger people to get into that area.
Very good point. Also the younger people and the education. And now I would like to give the floor to Gerard. I don't know what your question, please.
Thank you very much, Jerry Clabby. I'm with the Ministry for the Environment in Ireland. And it's just a reflection. I mean, I think the discussion has been very rich, and I welcome the thinking about systems, which I think is really important. But one of the aspects I think that we need to just be cognizant of is, while we need to communicate and talk about benefits and long-term advantages and, you know, employment numbers globally going up or whatever, I think part of what we need to say to policymakers is that within this there's change, and that change means some people win and some people lose. And I think we just need to be honest about that, because they need access to levers, policy levers, which can address that. And I think some of the reason you see these issues emerging between urban and rural is because once you start doing this in real space, in real time, in real places, then it becomes obvious who potentially is going to be advantaged here and who potentially is going to be disadvantaged. And I think people, if you're asking people to make very serious changes, in other words, I might lose my job, but you're telling me I might get another job over here, they need support. They need to be confident that that's actually going to happen. There have been lots of times in the past when, you know, we've seen around the world transitions from one type of economy to another where communities have simply been left behind, and they've been told, yes, we look after you, or yes, there'll be jobs in the knowledge economy, but the knowledge economy isn't where they were, and they don't move, and so they're not able to access that. So I think, you know, and in particular, a lot of the time, I think the policy levers we're talking about are kind of economic or financial or budgetary policy issues, that needs to come more into the frame so the policymakers understand, yes, the consequence of doing this will be, and then how do we support that using the policy tools that we have available to us. But by not talking about it, so the whole area of just transition, I suppose, is really what I'm getting at, and that needs to be part of this, and it needs to be, because for people to be confident to move into a new future, they need to be confident that policymakers are aware of and addressing those kinds of issues. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There's a question behind. If you want to try to throw the microphone, we can take this question as well. Very interesting, the just transition aspect that you mentioned. We come back to this.
Yeah, thank you. My question is not on just transition, but on investments. The first question today in the panel was about acceleration. If we want to accelerate, we do need private investors. We cannot do it without them. And if you talk to private investors, everything boils down to the risk-return trade-off. They will do it if either there is a good expected return or a relatively low investment risk. So I wonder, for instance, for the macro modelers in the panel, have you included that? Have you factored that into the analysis? And for the panelists sitting here, have you considered that? I would like to know your thoughts about that. Because, for instance, for de-risking, there are several possibilities. You know, the European Commission has a very good scheme for de-risking. Public-private partnerships is another way. But for the expected returns, it's a little bit more tricky. So how can you attract, you know, the big pensions funds, the big insurers, the big endowments, the family offices to move into the transition and accelerate? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Before giving back to the presenters your question, thanks a lot. We have a diversity of people here in the room, and we saw from ministries, and I could expect that you're maybe from the private sector, but you didn't say who you are. Maybe you would just want to share this.
I'm a professor of finance at Vlerik Business School here in Belgium.
Thanks a lot. So I would like to give the questions back on the just transition and also on the question to the presenters on if this has been factored in. Maybe who would like to Paul?
Yeah, just briefly, Jerry, on your question of communication, you're spot on. Language matters, you know, and we got to be careful about over-promising this utopian future, and as well about, you know, over-threatening with this dystopian vision. You know, I think the public are jaded of that. I really don't like when people chat about, oh, this will be cheap. Nothing is cheap. This transition will not be cheap, okay? But it can be affordable if we do it correctly. And it will be hard, but it can be worthwhile, okay? So I think we need to be careful about the language, because people, you know, people have a filter against over-promising, and I think it's really important to be honest about the challenges that are ahead. But from a policy-making perspective, it's really important that we just don't think in terms of singular policy. If we identify a problem, there needs to be parallel policy to mitigate that. So it's before we rush out and tell people you're going to lose your job and there's no, there's no future for you, we need to think about the policies and the safety nets that we wrap around that, first of all, in terms of policies. And just coming back to one of the earlier points previously about communication, it's our ex-previous Minister of Climate used to always say, if you're in a room and everyone agrees with you, well, then you're in the wrong room, I think we need to be better at getting in the wrong room. We need to get better at talking about climate change without ever mentioning the word climate. That's a longer game. It's a harder sell because you're dealing with not individual companies or policies. You're dealing with individual people. That's a real challenge for all of us. But it's something that we don't really try enough to see what it can do. And it's about reframing, I think, the problems that are ahead and reframe the solutions that go with them as well.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting aspect about communicating to the ones that do not agree.
Did you want me to mention?
Sorry.
I was just sort of taken with the investment.
Yeah.
So I can't speak for the modelers, but I mean, in terms of the work that I'm involved with, which focuses on financing instruments. I mean, across Europe, there are, at the European level, there is a coherent set of mechanisms that are tried to work in concert with each other to address different stages of the innovation cycle, and those attract investors at those different stages aligned with their risk appetite. So you mentioned pension funds. Well, they've become slightly more risk sort of in line. They've become more, their appetite for risk has increased over the years, but they do like to see de-risked investments. Offshore wind is a good example of where they started to jump in once they could see that had been proven. In the North Sea, quite a lot of those big offshore wind farms are now backed by massive pension funds. And there's been a lot of refinancing in the offshore wind space after the initial public funding. That de-risking. So you need to replicate that, I think, across many different areas in order to unlock this private investment, which is there. But at the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of philanthropic money. The Gates Ventures is a good example, and they're working, with the Commission to de-risk certain carbon removal technologies like DACs. I think long-duration energy storage has had so much money over the last 10 years. I think it's become quite cost competitive and has been de-risked. So, that's where more mass money can come in from the market and from investors, consumers, retail investors. So it's about thinking imaginatively about how you de-risk that journey, but also how you sell it to the public. How they can be part of this low carbon future. Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay.
I think we will have time for one more question, but I see Massimo wanted also to come in on the last round of questions, or am I mistaken? It's a bit difficult, the communication here.
No, please go ahead and take another question. I'm happy to come in at the very end.
I was terrified about trying to catch it because I'm a very bad catch. Miles Allen, University of Oxford. We'll come back onto this in the CDR sessions later, but I hope it's okay to bring this up here because I'd really be interested in this panel's take on this sort of low carbon versus zero carbon future. And in particular, I mean, all our scenarios have us still using fossil fuels past 2050, just not causing global warming. And I think when we give the message to people we're going to phase out fossil fuels altogether, I'm using sort of inflammatory language deliberately, they tend to think, well, that's going to be really hard, very expensive, and I can't imagine that happening. So I think that's, in a sense, the sort of, that's the only possibility, maybe fueling some of the backlash. And because people just can't imagine it, and when those that do delve into it discover that that's actually not what happens in these scenarios. We do continue using fossil fuels out to 2100. We're just not. We just fix them. We don't. So is this a missing element in the narrative in Europe because we're so focused on just getting fossil fuels out of the system. We're not talking about what the role of fossil fuels will actually be in a net zero future. Or is the imperative of just getting them out of the system for all these other reasons overwhelming that? So we should just, therefore we shouldn't talk about it. I don't know the answer, but I'm interested in the panel's thoughts.
Interesting question. Thanks, Miles. I would say, Massimo, you wanted to come in. Maybe you have an answer to Miles.
I don't know. I think we should talk about more fossil fuels and not just about the clean stuff, because that's important for very. Sorry, I got disconnected. Even neutrality itself got as consequences. So the question of how you define that and how you make sure that people understand it correctly is critically important. What you're saying, Miles, is absolutely true, but it's also true that in those scenarios, the amount of fossil fuels left is compared to today is a very small fraction. So I think that narrative has to be clear. That the transitioning away, phase out, whatever naming convention we're going to find, it has to be very, very clear and very radical. Otherwise, you can give the false impression that actually we can live with a lot of fossil fuel and just solve it through CDR, which has been exactly the reason why CDR has been obviously, including in scenarios where it's been highly criticized. I think that the narrative has to start from there. And then once that point is clear on what we define by neutrality, meaning very small fossil fuel residual emission left, and so the discussion then going to the discussion of what is this residual emissions in which sectors, and to make it clear that it's maybe easier than we think it would be otherwise in a world where we would already go to complete zero fossil fuel emissions very soon. But I think it's a question of sequencing the narrative and making sure that it doesn't get reversed, or otherwise you can get the message really wrong, as you know well.
Great, Massimo. Yeah, of course. Paul.
Sorry, just to add to Massimo's point. Yeah, no, I agree, Miles. Look, we need massive reductions and probably modest removals, and we talk about one way more than the other. There's a reputational challenge with CDR, and it's kind of funny because typically the reputational challenges for the environmental movement came from external actors. Now they're coming from internal actors. There's narratives I've spoken in rooms saying how challenging it is to move away from fossil fuels. And as Massimo says, the amount of fossil fuels that we'll have left at the end of our lifetime will be very small, but we are going to need removals. But it has been dismissed as a scam. I've been called a fool. And that's something that's coming from internally within our own movement. So I think we need to get our own house in order, first of all. It's very hard to get away from it. The idea that we can live our lives without fossil fuels will either require massive societal restructuring, which I think is a level that people don't appreciate or understand. So we either put our faith in people to change or technology to deliver. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But I think the reputational challenges for CDR is something that percolates up to policymakers, which is unhelpful, unnecessary, and misrepresents the science. And it's something I think we need within this room to get an order beforehand.
Great. That's sorry. Do we have a? Oh, yeah, I will give the floor to you. I don't see, you can raise your hand as well. But no, thanks a lot, Paul, for already going almost into the next session after our break. But we are slowly coming to an end. But of course, Kimon, maybe your final observation or whatever you want to come in on the topics raised here.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm not there, so I cannot have interactions during the coffee break, but I would have loved to. Very interesting points. CDR, we have to realize that we won't get to 1.5 close to it without CDR. So we have to reconcile ourselves with this. But we have to be wary that even with CDR, the amount of fossil fuel, like power generation capacity, for instance, coupled with CDR, with CCS rather, will be massively smaller than the deployment of fossils today. So it's a matter of language, but is it phasing down? Is it phasing out? Certainly it's scaling down, and we have to be clear about that. And what I wanted to complement, I mean, there were a lot of discussions about psychology, about education, about training, jobs. All of that is very important to ensure buy-in from the largest amount of people. And I think if you just ask more general questions like, would you like a cleaner environment, or would you like to limit overconsumption in order to allow for your weekend walk in nature, you would have positive answers all across the political persuasion board. So it's more a matter of where me as a citizen of any type of profession do I see myself in that future. And I think there's a lot of pushback from people who do not see themselves in that future. So we have to make sure that we do find stories to tell that include rural futures. There's a lot of in what I presented, there was a lot of increase in biomass related jobs. That's really people working in the field to grow bioenergy, biofuels. DAC can be a rural activity. There's a lot of emission mitigation also that is not part of the energy system, but rather about land. So about a quarter of emission mitigations would come from the land sector. So that's really landscape restoration, restoring ecosystems, and making sure that this will exist over decades. So this is really stable jobs and increase activity and increase jobs that are related to the transition that need to be part of the narratives that we tell. Thank you.
Also, what we heard before, everybody is empowered to be part of this transition and to make it real. And maybe we need to use our imagination of the future that we want to live in. If it's a future without fossil fuels, that's also sort of utopia thinking that should be trained also in all rooms probably. I think we are good in time. We had a fantastic discussion, great presentations, great panelists. Big applause. Thanks a lot. And